There was a time when England genuinely believed witches walked among them. They believed there were women who could curse crops, kill livestock, even speak with the devil. And when that fear spread, it didn't stay as rumors. It turned into trials, interrogations, and executions. But the most terrifying figure in one of Britain's bloodiest witch hunts wasn't a witch. It was the man who claimed he could find them. His name was Matthew Hopkins, the self-appointed Witchfinder General. And this is how one man's ambition turned mass hysteria into mass murder. To understand how one ordinary young man could unleash such horror, you have to look at England in the 1640s. The country was tearing itself apart. In 1642, the English Civil War erupted. Royalists loyal to the king clashed with Parliament's forces in a brutal conflict that would last for years. In the eastern counties, especially Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk, law and order began to collapse. Courts became inconsistent. Local officials were overwhelmed or simply absent. Many communities were left to fend for themselves in a world filled with uncertainty. On top of the chaos of war came something even darker, an atmosphere thick with religious terror. This was the height of Puritan England, a deeply strict, God-fearing society obsessed with sin, Satan, and the constant battle between good and evil. In their eyes, witchcraft wasn't silly superstition. It was a real and deadly threat. A woman who could curse your crops, sicken your children, or speak directly with the devil was not just dangerous, she was an enemy of God himself. English law made it official. The Witchcraft Act of 1604 declared witchcraft a capital crime, punishable by death. And in those desperate times, with war raging, disease spreading, harvests failing, and sudden deaths haunting every village, people needed someone to blame. Illness wasn't random. Failed crops weren't bad luck. A child dying in the night wasn't tragedy. It was witchcraft. Matthew Hopkins was born around 1620 in the quiet village of Great Wenham, Suffolk, right in the heart of the region that would soon tremble at his name. He grew up in a strict Puritan household. His father, a local minister, preached fire and brimstone sermons about sin, Satan, and the constant battle between good and evil. From a young age, Hopkins was steeped in that world of devils, demons, and divine judgment. It shaped everything he would later become. There are no grand records of his early life. He likely received some education, and some accounts suggest he may have dabbled in law, though he never became a qualified lawyer. By his early 20s, he was just another ambitious young man. By 1644, Hopkins had moved to the small coastal town of Manningtree in Essex. He used money inherited from his father to buy part of a local inn, giving him a modest income. He dressed the part of a respectable gentleman, dark clothing, a serious demeanor, and often accompanied by his distinctive long-legged greyhound, a dog that would later appear in the terrifying confessions he extracted. In the chaos of civil war, when fear hung thick in the air and local authorities were weak, Matthew Hopkins saw an opportunity and he seized it. It began in the spring of 1645. In the small riverside town of Manningtree, Essex. Hopkins later claimed he overheard local women whispering about secret meetings with the devil. His ears pricked up. Suspicion quickly fell on an elderly, disabled widow named Elizabeth Clark, a frail, marginalized woman already whispered about in the community. Clark was vulnerable, poor, and easy to target. Once accused, she was dragged into a nightmare. Hopkins and his associates locked her away and began the watching. For days and nights on end, they refused to let her sleep. They kept constant vigil, eyes fixed on her in the dim candlelight. Exhausted, Disoriented and broken by endless questioning, Clark finally cracked. She confessed to making a pact with the devil. She claimed she had been his lover, and in her delirium she described her demonic familiars, strange animal spirits that supposedly suckled at hidden marks on her body. Worse still, she started naming others. Her confession opened the floodgates. More women were arrested. More sleepless nights followed. More desperate voices broke under the pressure. Within weeks, the accusations spread like wildfire through Manningtree and the surrounding villages. By the time the trials reached Chelmsford in July 1645, around 19 people, mostly women, had been condemned. Many were hanged. By 1645, Hopkins saw the terrifying opportunity before him. He didn't wait for invitations. He began traveling across the war-torn counties of East Anglia, Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk with his partner John Starn and a small team of assistants. Dressed in his dark gentleman's cloak, bucket-top boots, and broad hat, with his sleek greyhound trotting beside him, he presented himself as the ultimate authority on witchcraft. He gave himself a grand title, Witchfinder General. Local towns and villages, gripped by panic and desperate for answers, welcomed him with open arms. They paid him, and paid him well, to root out the evil in their midst. In an era when a farm laborer earned just 6 pence a day, Hopkins could demand fees that made him a wealthy man in a very short time. His operation ran like a well-oiled machine of terror. First came the watching. Suspects were isolated and deprived of sleep for days, sometimes weeks, until their minds shattered and they would say almost anything to make the ordeal stop. Then came the search for the witch's mark. Any mole, birthmark, or extra teat on the body where familiars supposedly fed. Hopkins and his prickers would stab these spots with needles. If the flesh didn't bleed or the victim felt no pain, it was taken as proof of guilt. And for the most dramatic spectacle, there was the swimming test. The accused, often elderly women, were bound with their thumbs tied to their toes and thrown into rivers or village ponds. If they floated, the water had rejected them, proving they were witches. If they sank, they were innocent. But many never survived the ordeal. These methods had zero scientific basis. They were cruel, humiliating, and often illegal even by the standards of the time. But in communities already poisoned by fear, superstition, and the chaos of civil war, they worked. Under this machine of fear and profit, the hunts exploded across East Anglia with horrifying speed. From 1645 to 1647, Matthew Hopkins and his associates swept through town after town, Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk, leaving a trail of accusations, broken bodies, and gallows in their wake. The pattern was always the same: arrival, payment, watching, pricking, confessions, and then death. Nowhere was the horror more concentrated than in the Suffolk town of Bury St. Edmunds in the summer of 1645. In a single mass trial, crowds watched as dozens of terrified men and women, most of them poor, elderly women, stood before the court. The proceedings moved with brutal efficiency. Confessions extracted through sleepless nights and relentless pressure were accepted as ironclad proof. Neighbors testified against neighbors. Old grudges and whispered suspicions became deadly evidence. On August 27, 1645, 18 people, 16 women and 2 men, were led to the gallows and hanged in one single day. It remains one of the largest mass executions for witchcraft in English history. Hopkins and his team are believed to have been responsible for the execution of over 100 people in just 3 short years. More than had been put to death for witchcraft in the previous century across the whole of England. Hundreds more were accused, imprisoned, and tortured. Many died in filthy cells before they ever reached the noose. Village greens that once hosted markets now hosted public executions. The air filled with the sounds of weeping families, the creak of ropes, and the grim silence that followed each drop. What had begun as suspicion in a quiet corner of Manningtree had become a full-blown epidemic of terror. Fear no longer needed an outside spark. It fed on itself. Every hanging proved to the community that witches were real. Every new confession justified the next round of arrests. By this point, the hunt had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just Matthew Hopkins driving it. Behind these shocking numbers lay a much darker truth. The vast majority of those who died were not dangerous witches. They were ordinary, powerless people, mostly poor widows, elderly women, and those already living on the margins of society. Many were targeted, not because of any real evidence, but because of petty grudges and everyday conflicts. A refused request for milk or bread, a heated argument with a neighbor, a lifetime of being different, too old, too ugly, too poor, or simply too strange in the eyes of the community. Once the finger was pointed, the machinery of fear made innocence almost impossible to prove. The accused were thrown into the same brutal cycle. Days without sleep, constant surveillance, needles driven into their flesh, and relentless questioning until their minds broke. Exhausted and desperate, many eventually confessed to impossible crimes, riding on broomsticks, kissing the devil, or sending demonic imps to kill their neighbors' livestock. And once they confessed, they were expected to name others. One broken soul could drag 10 more into the nightmare. In that twisted system, there was no real trial. There was only pressure and release through confession. Even those who bravely insisted on their innocence often found no mercy. Their silence or defiance was taken as further proof of guilt. Many never even made it to the gallows. They died slowly in damp, disease-ridden prisons, forgotten and alone. Matthew Hopkins didn't just hunt witches, he hunted the weak. And in the chaos of war and superstition, entire communities were willing to sacrifice their most vulnerable neighbors just to feel safe again. Yet no reign of terror lasts forever. By 1646, cracks were finally beginning to appear in Hopkins' deadly empire. Whispers of doubt grew louder. Some local officials and clergymen started questioning the reliability of the so-called evidence. One of the most powerful voices of opposition came from John Gall, a respected clergyman in Huntingdonshire. In a bold pamphlet, he openly challenged Hopkins' methods, arguing that the confessions were forced and the trials were little more than legalized murder. His words spread quickly among those who had grown weary of the constant fear and bloodshed. At the same time, the chaos of the English Civil War began to settle in parts of East Anglia. As central authorities regained control, local communities no longer felt the desperate need to rely on a wandering self-proclaimed witchfinder. Hopkins' lucrative business started to dry up. Fewer towns invited him. Fewer payments arrived. The fear that had once fueled his rise was slowly turning against him. By early 1647, his activities had largely ground to a halt. That same year, Matthew Hopkins died, still in his mid-20s. The exact cause remains uncertain. Some say it was tuberculosis, others whispered that he himself was subjected to the swimming test and drowned. Most historians believe he simply fell ill and passed quietly in his home county of Suffolk. There was no dramatic trial, no public punishment, no final reckoning for the hundreds of lives destroyed under his watch. His campaign of terror simply ended, but the scars it left on the region would linger for generations. Even after Hopkins' death, the events in East Anglia between 1644 and 1647 refused to fade into history. In just 3 years, more people were executed for witchcraft in this small corner of England than in the entire previous century. It remains the single bloodiest chapter of witch hunting in English history. But the real power of this story isn't in the body count. It's in how it happened. There was no royal decree, no government campaign, no central plan. Instead, it spread from village to village, fueled by fear, superstition, and ordinary people turning on their own neighbors. The same deadly pattern would repeat decades later across the Atlantic. In 1692, the Salem witch trials erupted in colonial America. Once again, accusations flew wildly. Confessions extracted under pressure led to more accusations. Fear fed on itself until it consumed an entire community. Both tragedies show the same terrifying truth. When people are desperate for answers, when fear clouds judgment, and when society rewards suspicion instead of evidence, a single ambitious man, or even no man at all, can unleash hell. Matthew Hopkins didn't invent witch hunting. He simply proved how easily it could be industrialized, and that lesson still echoes today. The most dangerous systems don't always come from kings or governments at the top. Sometimes they rise from the bottom, built on fear, sustained by belief, and carried forward by ordinary people who were simply scared. That is what makes the story of the Witchfinder General so haunting, even centuries later. Because if it could happen then, in a time of war, superstition, and broken authority, it raises a quiet, uncomfortable question. Could something like this happen again?